Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people awake for 5 days using an experimental gas-based stimulant. They were kept in a sealed environment to carefully monitor their oxygen intake so the gas didn't kill them, since it was toxic in high concentrations. This was before closed-circuit cameras, so they had only microphones and 5-inch thick glass porthole-sized windows in the chambers to monitor them. The chamber was stocked with books and cots to sleep on, but no bedding, as well as running water, a toilet, and enough dried food to last all 5 for over a month. The test subjects were political prisoners, deemed enemies to the state during World War II. Everything was fine for the first 5 days. The subjects hardly complained, having been promised falsely that they would be freed if they submitted to the test and didn't sleep for 30 days. Their conversations and activities were monitored, and it was noted that they continued to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents from their past. The general tone of their conversations took on a darker aspect after the 4-day mark. After 5 days, they started to complain about the circumstances and events that led them to where they were, and started to demonstrate severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began alternately whispering into the microphones and one-way mirrored portholes. Oddly, they all seemed to think that they could win the trust of the experimenters by turning over their comrades, the other subjects in captivity, with them. At first, the researchers suspected this was an effect of the gas itself. After 9 days, the first of them started to scream. He ran the length of the chamber repeatedly, yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight, at which point he continued attempting to scream, but was only able to produce occasional squeaks. The researchers postulated that he had physically torn his vocal cords. The most surprising thing about this behavior was how the other captives reacted to it, or rather, didn't react to it. They continued whispering into the microphones until the second of the captives began to scream. The 2 non-screaming captives took the books apart, smeared page after page with their own feces, and pasted them calmly over the glass portholes. The screaming promptly stopped. So did the whispering into the microphones. After 3 more days, the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure they were working, since they thought it impossible that no sound could be occurring with 5 people inside. The oxygen consumption in the chamber indicated that all 5 must be alive. In fact, it was the amount of oxygen 5 people would consume at a very heavy level of strenuous exercise. On the morning of the 14th, the researchers did something they said they would not do to get a reaction out of the captives. They used the intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke any response from the people they were afraid were either dead or in a vegetative state. They announced, "We're opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor, or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you your immediate freedom." To their surprise, they heard a calm voice respond in a single phrase, "We no longer want to be free." Debate broke out amongst the researchers and the military forces funding the research project. Unable to provoke any more response using the intercom, it was finally decided that they would open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The chamber was flushed of the stimulant gas and filled with fresh air, and immediately voices over the microphone began to object. 3 different voices began begging, as if pleading for the life of a loved one. They pleaded for the gas to be turned back on. The chamber was opened, and the soldiers were sent in to retrieve the test subjects. They began to scream louder than ever, and so did the soldiers when they saw what was inside. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although no one could rightly call the state that any of them were in alive. The food rations past day 5 had never been so much as touched. There were chunks of meat from the dead test subject's thigh and chest, stuffed into the drains in the center of the chamber, blocking it and allowing 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of the water on the floor was actually blood was never determined. All 4 survivors also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies. The destruction of flesh had exposed bones on their fingertips and indicated that the wounds were inflicted by hand, not with teeth, as the researchers initially had thought. Closer examination of the position and angles of the wounds indicated that most, if not all of them, were self-inflicted. The abdominal organs below the rib cage of all 4 test subjects had been removed, while the heart, lungs, and diaphragm remained in place. The skin and most of the muscles attached to the ribs had been ripped away, exposing the lungs through the rib cage. All the blood vessels and organs remained intact, but had been taken out and laid on the floor, fanning out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of the subjects. The digestive tract of all 4 could be seen working, digesting food. It quickly became apparent that what they had digested was their own flesh that they had ripped off and eaten over the course of days. Most of the soldiers were Russian special operatives at the facility, but still, many refused to return to the chamber to remove the test subjects. The subjects themselves continued to scream to be left in the chamber and begged and demanded that the gas be turned back on, lest they fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put up a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out. Another was gravely injured by having his testicles ripped off and an artery in his leg severed by one of the subject's teeth. Another 5 of the soldiers lost their lives, if you count the one that committed suicide in the weeks following the incident. In the struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured and bled out almost immediately. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of morphine derivative and still fought like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and arm of one doctor. His heart was seen to beat for a full 2 minutes after he'd bled out, to the point there was more air in his vascular system than blood. Even after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail for another 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone within reach and just repeating the word more over and over, weaker and weaker, until he finally fell silent. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility, the 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begging for the gas, demanding to be kept alive. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room that the facility had. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back within his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedatives that they had given him to prepare for surgery. He fought furiously against his restraints when the anesthetic gas was brought out to put him under. He managed to tear most of the way through a 4-inch wide leather strap on one wrist, even though the weight of a 200-pound soldier was holding that wrist. It took only a little more anesthetic than normal to put him under, and the instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. In the autopsy of the test subject that had died on the operating table, it was found that his blood had triple the normal levels of oxygen. The muscles that were still attached to his skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in his struggle to not be subdued. Most of them were from the force of his own muscles that they had extended on them. The second survivor had been the first of the group to start screaming. His vocal cords were destroyed. He was unable to beg or object to surgery, and he only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought near him. He shook his head, yes, when someone suggested reluctantly that they should try the surgery without anesthetic, and did not react for the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what remained of his skin. The surgeon presiding stated repeatedly that it should not be medically possible for the patient to still be alive. One terrified nurse assisted the surgery stated that she had seen the subject's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, the subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk while struggling. Assuming this must be something of drastic importance, the surgeon had a pen and pad fetched so the patient could write his message. It was simple. Keep cutting. The other 2 test subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetic as well, although they had to be injected with a paralytic for the duration of the operation. The surgeon found it impossible to perform the operation while the patients laughed continuously. Once paralyzed, the subjects could only follow the attending researcher with their eyes. The paralytic cleared their system in an abnormally short period of time, and they were soon trying to escape their bonds. The moment they could speak, they were again asking for the stimulant gas. The researchers tried asking them why they had injured themselves, why they had ripped out their own guts, and why they wanted to be given the gas again. Only one response was given: I must remain awake. All 3 subjects restrained were reinforced as they were placed back into the chamber, awaiting determination as to what should be done with them. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors for having failed the stated goals of the project, considered euthanizing the surviving subjects. The commanding officer, an ex-KGB, instead saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected, but they were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, all 3 stopped struggling the moment it was let slip that they were going back on the gas. It was obvious that, at this point, all 3 were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of the subjects that could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds with all his might. First left, then right, then left again for something to focus on. The remaining subject was holding his head off his pillow and blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired to the EEG machine, most of the researchers were monitoring his brain waves in surprise. They were normal, most of the time, but sometimes flatlined inexplicably. It looked as if he were repeatedly suffering brain death before returning to normal. As they focused on the paper scrolling out of the brainwave monitor, only one nurse saw the man's eyes slip shut at the same moment his head hit the pillow. His brainwaves immediately changed to that of deep sleep, then flatlined for the last time as his heart simultaneously stopped. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in now. His brainwaves showed the same flat line as the one that had just died while falling asleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside, as well as 3 researchers. One of the named 3 immediately drew his gun and shot the commander point blank between the eyes, then turned the gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out as well. He pointed the gun at the remaining subject, still restrained to a bed, as the remains of the members of the medical and research team fled the room. "I won't be locked in here with these things. Not with you," he screamed at the man strapped to the table. "What are you? I must know," he demanded. The subject smiled. "Have you forgotten so easily?" the subject asked. "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralyze when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread." The researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly croaked out, "So nearly free." I first met in person with Mary E. in the summer of 2007. I'd arranged with her husband of 15 years, Terrence, to see her for an interview. Mary had initially agreed since I was not a newsman, but rather an amateur, gathering information for a very early college assignment, and, if all went according to plan, some pieces of fiction. We scheduled the interview for a particular weekend when I was in Chicago, on an unrelated matter. But at the last moment, Mary changed her mind and locked herself in the couple's bedroom, refusing to meet with me. For half an hour I sat with Terrence as we camped outside the bedroom door. I listened and took notes while he attempted, fruitlessly, to calm his wife. The things Mary said made very little sense, but fit with the pattern I was expecting. Though I could not see her, I could tell from her voice that she was crying, and more often than not, her objections to speaking with me centered around an incoherent diatribe on her dreams, or rather her nightmares. Terrence apologized profusely when he ceased the exercise, and I did my best to take it in strides, recalling that I wasn't a reporter in search of a story, but merely a curious young man in search of information. Besides, I thought at the time that I could perhaps find another, similar case if I put my mind and my resources to it. Mary E. was the sysop for a small Chicago-based bulletin board system in 1992, when she first encountered smile.jpg, and her life changed forever. She and Terrence had been married for only 5 months. Mary was one of an estimated 400 people who saw the image when it was posted as a hyperlink on the BBC, though She is the only one who has spoken out about the experience. The rest have remained anonymous, or perhaps have died. In 2005, when I was only in the 10th grade, Smile.jpg was first brought to my attention by my burgeoning interest in web-based phenomena. Mary was the most often cited victim of what is sometimes referred to as Smile Dog, the being Smile.jpg is reputed to display. What caught my interest, other than the obvious macabre elements of the cyber legend and my proclivity towards such things, was the sheer lack of information, usually to the point that people don't believe it even exists, other than as a rumor or maybe as a hoax. It is unique because, though the entire phenomenon centers around a picture file, that file is nowhere to be found on the internet. Certainly, many bits of photo-manipulated simulacrum litter the web, showing up with the most frequency on sites such as image boards like 4chan, particularly the X-Focused Paranormal subboard. They are suspected as fakes because they do not have the same effect the true Smile.jpg is believed to have, namely, sudden onset temporal lobe epilepsy and acute anxiety. This purported reaction in the viewer is one of the reasons the phantom-like Smile.jpg is regarded with such disdain, since it is patently absurd. Still, depending on whom you ask, the reluctance to acknowledge the Smile.jpg's existence might be just as much out of fear as it is out of disbelief. Neither Smile.jpg nor Smile.dog is mentioned anywhere on Wikipedia, though the website features articles on such other, perhaps more scandalous shock sites, such as Hello.jpg or Two Girls, One Cup. Any attempt to create a page pertaining to Smile.jpg is similarly deleted by any of the encyclopedia's many admins. Encounters with Smile.jpg are the stuff of internet legend. Mary E.'s story is not unique. There are unverified rumors of Smile.jpg showing up in the early days of Usenet, and even one persistent tale that in 2002 a hacker flooded the forums of humor and satire website Something Awful with a deluge of Smile.dog pictures, rendering almost half the forum users at the time epileptic. It is also said that the mid to late 90s saw Smile.jpg circulate on Usenet as an attachment of a chain email with the subject line, "Smile, God loves you." Yet, despite the huge exposure these stunts would generate, there are very few people who admit to having experienced any of them, and no trace of the file or any links have ever been discovered. Those who claim to have seen Smile.jpg often weakly joke that they were far too busy to save a copy of the picture on their hard drive. However, all alleged victims offer the same description of the photo: a dog-like creature, usually described as appearing similar to a Siberian husky, illuminated by the flash of a camera, sitting in a dim room, the only background detail that is visible being a human hand extended from the darkness near the left side of the frame. The hand is empty, but is usually described as beckoning. Of course, most attention is given to the dog, or dog creature, as some victims are more certain than others about what they claim to have seen. The muzzle of the beast is reputedly split in a wide grin, revealing 2 rows of very white, very straight, very sharp, very human-looking teeth. This is, of course, not a description given immediately after viewing the picture, but rather a recollection of the victims, who claim to have seen the picture endlessly, repeating in their mind's eye during the time that they are in reality having an epileptic fit. These fits are reported to continue indeterminately, often while the victims sleep, resulting in very vivid and disturbing nightmares. These may be treated with medication, though in some cases it's more effective than others. Mary E., I assumed, was not on the effective medication. That was why, after my visit to her apartment in 2007, I sent out feelers to several folklore and urban legend-oriented news groups, websites, and mailing lists, hoping to find the name of a supposed victim of Smile.jpg who felt more interested in talking about their experience. For a time, nothing happened, and at length I forgot completely about my pursuits, since I'd begun my freshman year of college and was quite busy. Mary contacted me via email, however, near the beginning of 2008. To jml@*.com from marye@*.net. Subject, last summer's interview. Dear Mr. L., I'm incredibly sorry about my behavior last summer when you came to interview me. I hope you understand that it was no fault of yours, but rather my own problem that led me to act out as I did. I realize that I could have handled the situation with more decorum. However, I hope you will forgive me. At the time, I was afraid. You see, for 15 years I've been haunted by Smile.jpg. Smile.dog comes to me in my sleep every night. I know that sounds silly, but it's true. This is an ineffable quality about my dreams, my nightmares, that makes them completely unlike any real dream I've ever had. I do not move and I do not speak. I simply look ahead, and the only thing ahead of me is the scene from that horrible picture. I see the beckoning hand. I see the Smile.dog. It talks to me. It's not a dog, of course, though I'm not quite sure what it really is. It tells me it will leave me alone if only I do as it asks. All I must do, it says, is spread the word. That's how it phrases its demands, and I know exactly what it means. It wants me to show it to someone else. And I could. The week after my incident, I received in the mail a manila envelope with no return address. Inside was only a 3.5-inch floppy diskette. Without having to check, I knew precisely what was on it. I thought for a long time about my options. I could show it to a stranger, a coworker, could even show it to Terrence, as much as the idea disgusted me. And what would happen then? Well, if Smile.dog kept its word, I could sleep. But if it lied, what would I do? Who was to say something worse would not come for me if I did as the creature asked? So I did nothing for 15 years, though I kept the diskette hidden amongst my things. Every night for 15 years, Smile.dog has come to me in my sleep and demanded that I spread the word. For 15 years I have stood strong, though there have been hard times. Many of my fellow victims on the BBS board, where I first encountered Smile.jpg, stopped posting. I heard some of them committed suicide. Others remain completely silent, simply disappearing off the face of the web. They're the ones I worry about the most. I sincerely hope you will forgive me, Mr. L., but last summer when you contacted me and my husband about an interview, I was near my breaking point. I decided I was going to give you the floppy disk. I did not care if Smile.dog was lying or not. I wanted it to end. You were a stranger, someone I had no connection with, and I thought I would not feel sorrow when you took the diskette as part of your research and sealed your fate. Before you arrived, I realized what I was doing, plotting to ruin your life. I could not stand the thought, and in fact, I still can't. I'm ashamed, Mr. L., and I hope that this warning will dissuade you from further investigation of Smile.jpg. You may in time encounter someone who is, if not weaker than I, then wholly more depraved, someone who will not hesitate to follow Smile.dog's orders. Stop while you are still whole. Sincerely, Mary E. Terrence contacted me later that month with news that his wife had killed herself while cleaning up the various things she left behind, closing email accounts and the like. He happened upon the above message. He was a man in shambles. He wept as he told me to listen to his wife's advice. He found the diskette, he revealed, and burned it until it was nothing but a stinking pile of blackened plastic. The part that most disturbed him, however, was how the diskette had hissed as it melted, like some sort of animal, he said. I'll admit I was a little uncertain about how to respond to this. At first I thought perhaps it was a joke, with the couple belatedly playing with the situation in order to get a rise out of me. A quick check of several Chicago newspapers online, however, proved that Mary E. had indeed died. There was, of course, no mention of suicide in the article. I decided that, for a time at least, I would not further pursue the subject of Smile.jpg, especially since I had finals coming up at the end of May. But the world has odd ways of testing us. Almost a full year after I'd returned from my disastrous interview with Mary E., I received another email. To jml@*.com from Elizer82@*.com. Subject, Smile. Hello. I found your email address through a mailing list. Your profile said you're interested in Smile Dog. I have saw it. It's not as bad as everyone says. I've sent it to you. Just spreading the word. The final line chilled me to my bones. According to my email client, there was one file attachment called, naturally, Smile.jpg. I considered downloading it for some time. It was most likely a fake, I imagined, and even if it wasn't, I was never wholly convinced of Smile.jpg's peculiar powers. Mary E.'s account had shaken me, yes, but she was probably mentally unbalanced anyway. After all, how could a simple image do what Smile.jpg was said to accomplish? What sort of creature was it that could break one's mind with only the power of the eye? And if such things are patently absurd, then why did the legend exist at all? If I downloaded the image, if I looked at it, and if Mary turned out to be correct, if Smile Dog came to me in my dreams, demanding I spread the word, what would I do? Would I live my life as Mary had, fighting against the urge to give in until I died? Or would I simply spread the word, eager to be put to rest? And if I chose the later route, how could I do it? Whom could I burden with this? If I went through my earlier intentions to write a short article about Smile.jpg, I decided I could attach it as evidence, and anyone who read the article, anyone who took an interest, would be affected. And even assuming the Smile.jpg attachment in the email was genuine, would I be capricious enough to save myself in that manner? Could I spread the word? Yes. Yes, I could. During the summer of 2003, events in the northeastern United States involving a strange, human-like creature sparked brief local media interest before an apparent blackout was enacted. Little to no information was left intact, as most online and written accounts of the creature were mysteriously destroyed. Primarily focused in rural New York State, and once found in Idaho, self-proclaimed witnesses told stories of their encounters with a creature of unknown origins. Emotions ranged from extremely traumatic levels of fright and discomfort to an almost childlike sense of playfulness and curiosity. While their published versions are no longer on record, the memories remain powerful. Several of the involved parties began looking for answers that year. In early 2006, the collaboration had accumulated nearly 24 documents dating between the 12th century and present day, spanning 4 continents. In almost all cases, the stories were identical. I've been in contact with a member of this group and was able to get some excerpts from their upcoming book. A Mariner's Log, 1691. He came to me in my sleep. From the foot of my bed, I felt a sensation. He took everything. We must return to England. We shall not come here again at the request of the Rake. A journal entry, translated from Spanish, 1880. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have seen his eyes when I close mine. They are hollow, black. They saw me and pierced me. His wet hand. I will not sleep. His voice. And the text from there is unintelligible. A Suicide Note, 1964. As I prepare to take my life, I feel it necessary to assuage any guilt or pain I have induced through this act. It is not the fault of anyone other than him. For once I awoke and felt his presence, and once I awoke and saw his form. Once again I awoke and heard his voice, and looked into his eyes. I cannot sleep without fear of what I might next awake and experience. I cannot ever wake. Goodbye. Found in the same wooden box were 2 empty envelopes addressed to William and Rose, and 1 loose personal letter with no envelope. Dearest Lenny, I have prayed for you. He spoke your name. From a Witness, 2006. 3 years ago, I had just returned from a trip to Niagara Falls with my family on the 4th of July. We were all exhausted after a long day of driving, so my husband and I put the kids straight to bed and called it a night. At about 4 a.m., I woke up, thinking my husband had gotten up to use the restroom. I used the moment to steal back the sheets, only to wake him in the process. I apologized and told him I thought he was out of bed. When he turned to face me, he gasped and pulled his feet up from the end of the bed so quickly, his knees almost knocked me out of bed. He then grabbed me and said nothing. After adjusting to the dark for a half second, I was able to see what had caused the strange reaction. At the foot of the bed, sitting and facing away from us, was what appeared to be a naked man, or a large, hairless dog of some sort. Its body position was disturbing and unnatural, as if it had been hit by a car or something. For some reason, I was not instantly frightened by it, but more concerned as to its condition. At this point, I was somewhat under the assumption that we were supposed to help him. My husband was peering over his arms and knees, tucked into the fetal position, occasionally glancing at me before returning to the creature. In a flurry of motion, it scrambled around the side of the bed and then crawled quickly in a flailing sort of way right along the covers until it was less than a foot from my husband's face. It was completely silent for about 30 seconds, probably closer to 5, but it seemed like a while, just looking at my husband. It then placed its hand on its knees and ran into the hallway, leading to the kids' room. I screamed and ran for the light switch, planning to stop the thing before it could hurt my children. When I got to the hallway, the light from the bedroom was enough to see it crouching, hunched over about 20 feet away. It turned around and looked directly at me, covered in blood. I flipped the switch on the wall and saw my daughter, Clara. The creature ran down the stairs as my husband and I rushed to help her. She was very badly injured and spoke only once in her short life. She said, "He is the Rake." My husband drove his car into a lake that night while rushing our daughter to the hospital. They didn't survive. Being a small town, news got around pretty quickly. The police were helpful at first, and the local newspapers took a lot of interest. However, the story was never published, and the local television never followed up. For several months, my son Justin and I stayed in a hotel near my parents' house. After we decided to return home, I began looking for answers myself. I eventually located a man in the next town over who had a similar story. We got in contact and talked about our experiences. He knew of 2 other people in New York who had seen the creature we now refer to as the Rake. It took the 4 of us 2 solid years of hunting on the internet and writing letters to come up with a small collection of what we believed to be accounts of the Rake. None of them gave any details, history, or follow-up. One journal had an entry involving the creature in its first 3 pages, then never mentioned it again. A ship's log explained nothing of the encounter, saying only that they were told to leave by the Rake. That was the last entry in the log. There were, however, many instances where the creature's visit was one of a series of visits to the same person. Multiple people also mentioned being spoken to, my daughter included. This led us to wonder if the Rake had visited any of us before our last encounter. I set up a digital recorder near my bed and left it running all night, every night, for 2 weeks. I would tediously scan through the sounds of me rolling around in my bed each day when I woke up. By the end of the 2nd week, I was quite used to the occasional sounds of sleep, while blurring through the recording at 8 times normal speed. It still took almost an hour every day. On the first day of the 3rd week, I thought I heard something different. What I found was a shrill voice. It was the Rake. I can't listen to it long enough to even begin to transcribe it. I haven't let anyone else listen to it either. All I know is that I've heard it before, and I now believe that it spoke when I was sitting in front with my husband. I don't remember hearing anything at the time, but for some reason, the voice on the recorder immediately brings me back to that moment. The thoughts that must have been going through my daughter's head make me very upset. I've not seen the Rake since he ruined my life, but I know that he's been in my room while I sleep. I know and fear that one night I'll wake up to see him staring at me. I once lived a normal life. I was a groundskeeper at a local cemetery. Wasn't the best job, but hey, paid the bills. I lived alone in an apartment complex that stood about a mile from the cemetery. I would spend my time writing short stories about the boring life and the days at the cemetery. When I worked, it was usually during the afternoon, into the twilight hours. I never would have worked at night. That place is creepy enough as it is, thank you very much. I stayed far away from it during the night. It was always the same routine. Show up at the cemetery, gather my tools, go out and pick up trash and tidy up gravestones till it started to get dark. Then go home and do whatever. Nothing special. The routine continued for a year and a half, ever since the day I got the job. Not once did I ever run into anything spooky, like you'd see in those cheesy horror movies. There was never any black cats or curses, and certainly no zombies crawling out of the ground to eat my brains. However, there was one day that would change my life forever. The day I saw him, or rather it. The day I saw the Slender Man. Started off like any other day. I walked to the cemetery, got my tools, and headed out to pick up trash. But something felt different that day. It was hard to explain, but I felt as though I was being watched. I would constantly look around, nervous, only to find there was nothing there. The only sound I heard were birds chirping in the trees and the occasional car that passed by. So I spent the entire day on edge, something in the back of my mind telling me that there was something else with me in the cemetery. At the end of my shift, as I headed back to put my tools away for the night, I noticed that the birds were gone. There were no cars passing by anymore. Everything was eerily quiet. Just then, I saw what appeared to be a man standing about 100 feet from me. From what I could see, he was abnormally tall and wore a black suit jacket with a white shirt and a black tie. Because it was beginning to get dark, I couldn't see his face very well, so I couldn't tell if it was someone familiar. I called out to him, but he didn't move. He just stood there, like a statue. I began to walk towards him, accidentally dropping my tools along the way. I bent down to pick them up, and when I looked to where the man was, he was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. I scratched my head and shook it off, thinking that I was just seeing things because I was overworked. I put my tools away and headed home, but I walked a little quicker than usual. I was still a little nervous, and questions filled my head. Who was that man? Why did he just stand there? How did he disappear so quickly? Was he real or just a figment of my imagination? That night, I barely slept at all. It was my thoughts that caused my insomnia. The next day at the cemetery, I was even more tense. I felt like if a leaf were to fall on my head, I'd scream in terror. Unfortunately for me, the more tense I got, the more distracted I got from my work. Soon enough, Jeff, my boss, came out to talk to me. Jeff's a good guy. He and my father went way back, and he was the one who gave me the job as a groundskeeper in the first place. He and I were also good friends, and he knew that I wasn't acting myself today. "Steven, what's the matter?" he asked me. "You seem a little off today. Is something wrong?" I don't want to sound like a crazy person, but I knew I couldn't lie to Jeff, so I told him the truth. "Saw something yesterday, Jeff. There was a man in a suit that was just standing in the cemetery. He didn't do anything, and then he just disappeared out of nowhere. Kind of freaked me out." Jeff looked at me like I was crazy. "Wait, what did you say the man looked like?" I was surprised that he actually somewhat believed my story. He was really tall, with a nice suit on. It was too dark, so I couldn't see his face. Jeff rubbed his head and sighed. "I don't believe it." I rolled my eyes, thinking that he was talking about my story, but then he continued. "I didn't think the legends were true, but what you've explained to me, Steven, verifies that maybe the Slender Man does exist." Now I was the one who was confused. The Slender Man? What's a Slender Man? "I'm not the one you should be asking those questions of, Steven. I only know a little bit about him, but I have a friend, James. He knows everything there is to know about the Slender Man." He took out a piece of paper and a pen and scribbled something down. "This is where he lives," he says, handing it to me. "I'll give him a call and tell him what you saw and that you're coming by to learn more about the Slender Man. Any questions you have, he'll answer them." Still thought the idea was a little crazy, but I wanted to know exactly what this Slender Man was. That night, I did as Jeff suggested, paid a visit to his friend James. As I entered his house, I saw that he was already seated at a table with pictures scattered all around. When I walked through the door, James greeted me with a smile. "Ah, Steven, Jeff told me you were coming. Please, take a seat." I pulled up a chair to the table and began to observe some of the pictures he had laid out. "Jeff told me that you think you saw the Slender Man, and that you wanted more info on him. Well, you've come to the right place. I nodded, and he began to tell me everything he knew. One thing you should know about the Slender Man is he's not human. We don't know what he is exactly, but we know for sure that he isn't human. People who have seen him describe him just as you saw him, but he's sometimes seen with black tentacles emerging from his back. He's a fearsome creature, and kills most likely for fun. Now, let me give you a little backstory on the Slender Man. One of the first recorded accountings of him was back in the mid-1500s in Germany. A woodcut artist by the name of Hans Frankenberg created a piece that displayed a creature that looks not unlike the Slender Man. It was discovered in Halsberg Castle in 1883. Here's what it looks like. He slid one of the pictures over to me, one that depicted a knight dueling with a strange humanoid creature with multiple arms and legs. James continued. Now, Hans was known for his realistic depictions of human anatomy, but as you can see in his work, the creature on the right has multiple arms and an oddly shaped face. This work differs greatly from all his other works. I was intrigued at the amount of knowledge that James had, but he wasn't quite finished. He slid another picture over to me, this one showing several children as they frolicked in a playground. Nothing out of the ordinary, except for the fact that a man that looked exactly like the one I'd seen in the cemetery was standing ominously in the background. Looking at that picture sent a chill racing down my spine. Now, this here is the first recorded photograph of the Slender Man. You can see him in the background. According to records, every single child in that photograph disappeared shortly after it was taken. They haven't been seen since. I was astonished. Couldn't believe what I was seeing. James then passed me a few more modern-looking pictures. Each one seemed like a normal, everyday nature or family photo. But in the background of them all was the same creature, looming in the shadows. That's pretty much all you need to know, James concluded. Any questions? I shook my head, still trying to wrap my mind around what exactly this thing I had seen the other day was. The Slender Man is a mysterious force, Stephen, James told me. Nobody knows exactly why he does the things he does, whether he does it for sport or if he's a pawn for some higher being. We will likely never know. Coming to this realization, I knew I had to do something. I decided the next day I would find the Slender Man and see for myself what kind of monster he was. I figured he was probably still in the vicinity of the cemetery, so I would hopefully find and capture him. I wouldn't try that if I were you, James warned. The Slender Man has powers that you wouldn't believe. It's best to just let nature take its course. Whatever you do, don't try to approach him if you see him. I assured James that I would not try such a thing, and thanked him for the information as I left. However, I was still content on attempting to end the Slender Man's reign of terror, once and for all. Working through the next day like it was any other day, I kept my guard up the whole time, looking for any sign of the Slender Man. There was no sign of him that day, but once my shift was over, I put away my tools, except for my flashlight, and headed over to where I'd seen him standing a couple of days prior. Like that faithful day, everything was eerily quiet. No birds, no cars made any sound. I could sense he was nearby. I approached the area where I'd first seen him and sat on one of the gravestones, waiting. I knew he would come eventually. After about 20 minutes, I began to give up hope until I heard rustling coming from the woods that surrounded the cemetery. It was beginning to get dark, and I got a little nervous. I'd never been in that area when it was that dark before. It was almost pitch black now, and I had only the moon and my flashlight for light. I gathered up some confidence and walked into the woods, my flashlight shining through the darkness. I followed the rustling sound, and it began to get louder and louder. It grew closer and closer, and my heart began to race. Sweat formed on my brow, and my hands shook as I tried to hold the flashlight steady. "Show yourself," I ordered, as loudly as I could. Suddenly, from out of the brush of the woods came a squirrel. I let out a deep sigh of relief as the squirrel just stared at me for a few seconds. Then it took off, running away from me. I thought nothing of it. It was a squirrel, after all. They're usually afraid of their own shadow. I turned around, and it felt like I walked into a brick wall. I fell hard to the ground and dropped my flashlight. I couldn't see much, but I could see the outline of a figure, illuminated by the full moon. I stumbled around like a madman, grabbing for my flashlight. I found it and shone it at the figure. I started at its legs and moved the light up its body. When I hit its torso, I saw that it was wearing a suit and tie. I swear, I felt my heart stop for a moment. I shined the light up at its face and gasped in horror at what I saw. This creature had no face. It looked like an empty canvas. No hair, no face, no nothing. Just a pale white head, looking down at me, as if it knew that I was there. He must have been at least 9 or 10 feet tall. I stumbled to my feet and felt 2 hands grasp my neck. I began to panic as my heart raced faster and faster, my breathing getting heavy. The creature pulled me closer and raised me up so that my head was level with his. I stared into where its face should have been, and he tilted his head as if he were observing me. I could barely breathe as his grasp grew tighter around my neck. I struggled furiously, and suddenly several black tentacles emerged from the creature's back. I knew this was the end. I was about to become another victim of the Slender Man. He raised one of those tentacles, and I braced myself for death. However, I then heard a faint bark, like from a dog, and a few men calling my name. The creature turned his head towards the noise and then back to me. He took the raised tentacle and wrapped it around my forearm. A burning pain shot through my entire arm, and I winced. If that thing's hand hadn't been cutting off my air supply, I would have screamed bloody murder. The pain was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. The creature dropped me to the ground and stood over me for a few seconds. I looked up to it, and I swear he nodded to me before fading into the surrounding darkness. I gasped for breath as the men found me. Jeff was with them. "Steve, what the hell were you doing here? I heard you yelling, so we came to find out what was wrong." With what little energy I had left, I let out a whisper, barely audible. It was the Slender Man." Then everything went black. When I woke up, I found myself in a hospital bed. My neck and forearm were still in pain. Once I'd gained complete consciousness, I looked down at my forearm and saw that there was a black mark where the Slender Man had wrapped his tentacle around me. I stared at it for a few minutes, trying to contemplate why he had spared my life and left me with just a black mark. Before I had a chance to think about it, Jeff and James came into the room, Jeff carrying my laptop. "How you feeling, Steve?" Jeff asked. "Still in a lot of pain," I replied. "The doctors say I should be out in a couple of days, maybe even tomorrow." "I warned you not to try to approach him." James shook his head. I figured he'd be a little upset with me. "I know. I really wish I'd listened to you." He put his hand on my shoulder to comfort me. "It's all right. I know how you feel. You wanted to get an up-close and personal view of the Slender Man. Who wouldn't? I'm just surprised he let you live." I was just as surprised. Had it not been for the men calling my name, I probably wouldn't have gotten away so lucky. Soon later, Jeff handed me my laptop. "Why'd you bring this?" I asked. "Because you need to tell your story," he replied. "The story about how you met and survived the Slender Man. I'm sure a lot of people are going to want to hear about it." "But who's to say anybody will believe it?" I asked skeptically. James smiled and put a hand on my shoulder. "Stephen, for every skeptic there's a believer. I'm sure someone out there will believe it. Hell, maybe there's someone who had an experience just like yours. Now get some rest before you start writing. You'll need it." The two started to walk away until I called them over. "Hey guys, why do you think he left me with this?" I showed them the black mark on my arm, and James rubbed his chin. "No idea. I've never heard of anyone reporting a case of that happening. Maybe since you were lucky enough to survive him, he gave it to you as something to remember him by." He smiled, and the two walked out of the room. I chuckled to myself at the thought, but then I realized that maybe that wasn't so crazy of an idea after all. I opened my laptop and began writing this story, my story, the story of my experience with the Slender Man. If I learned anything from that ordeal, it's that we may never know who or what the Slender Man is exactly, or where he's going to show up next. But I give this warning to you, dear readers. Beware the Slender Man. My family has a terrible curse that causes me to live in constant anxiety. We're butchers. We don't run a national corporation for it or anything, but our quality has always been impeccable. 5-star Google reviews, top word of mouth. We would probably even have a Michelin star if it were possible for places other than restaurants. Somehow, we've been able to produce the most delicious, soft, mouth-melting meats, better than Wagyu beef. But the story for how this came to be, for how this is not as happy-go-lucky as our service. My family have been butchers for hundreds of years. Even our last name is Butcher, and somehow we have not changed professions since that was given. Let me clarify that this is my story, my explanation for why I wish I was dead, even though I don't want to die. But I must first tell the story of my ancestors. I'm not sure exactly how long ago this was, but the story goes that it was during the medieval age. My forebears always kept honesty as the shop's top moral framework. Because of this, they were often the choice meat shop for even lords and ladies of the nearby land, till one day when a new shop opened up. My ancestors were not worried because their shop was so successful. This shop did not make a sale for days. However, on a day no more special than any other, the town drunk somehow found himself in the other shop, thinking it was my ancestors' family store. He ordered a cut of leg meat, drunkenly swaggered it home, and fell into a booze-induced slumber. The next day, he cooked the meat, ate it, and came running into town, directly into our shop. He asked what he had ordered in his drunken stupor, as it was the most savory thing he had ever eaten. My family had told him that he did not visit the shop yesterday. Not at all. They then realized that it had to have been the other shop that he'd gone to by mistake. My family had said there was no way it could have been the other shop, so they all went over as a group, grandfather, father, son, and drunk. They asked the shopkeeper what he had ordered, and they simply gestured to the stack of cubed meat on display. With furrowed brows, my family had purchased a cube and immediately went back to cook it. After doing so, the way they would cook any other product, the cubed meat was placed on their tongues. Within seconds, they realized they had to keep the other shop's meat a secret to the rest of the town. They told the drunk that he must never tell anyone about the other shop's quality of meat, and he promised not to. But a drunk would not be a drunk if they didn't yell secrets to the entire town while in their cups. It did not take long for people to hear about the other shop and its miraculously tasty meat. My ancestors' butcher shop was in danger of closing within weeks. The son could not stand to see his family at such a low point, and being the youngest, he wanted to prove that he was helpful. He began to spy on the other shopkeeper in hopes of figuring out their secret to the delicious cubes. Their method, from what the son could see, all seemed very normal. But every weekend, they would take their wagon out of town. The son was not sure where, as he was not able to stealthily follow behind the trees and buildings. He asked his father and grandfather for permission to follow, and was firmly told no, that doing so would be a terrible thing, and that they were honest people. God would help them, eventually, but God did not. A week later, the father grew ill. Without his labor, the shop grew even less profitable, and they could not afford the things needed to help him get better: food, medicine, and time. The son could not bear it. That weekend there was a new moon. It was the best opportunity for him to sneak into the wagon. In the dark of night, he endured the long, bumpy ride in the wooden cage until they arrived. As soon as the wagon stopped, voices could be heard, but it was indiscernible what they were saying. The sun peeked out over the cover and saw two figures heading into a building. All became quiet. He slipped out of the wagon and made his way, as slyly as he could, into the same building. Inside, he saw the two figures carrying a bloody wrapping of meat. Finally, the son had discovered the source of the delicious carcass, the shopkeeper's supplier. The two figures repeated this several times, and when only one figure returned inside, he knew he had to get back on the wagon before it took off for his hometown. Just as he exited the building, the horse began trotting. He sprinted as fast as he could, the sound of his footsteps hidden by the horse, and jumped into the wagon right before his leg muscles would have reached their physical limits. The ride back was not bumpy. He did not feel as if he was in a wooden cage anymore, but a bed of gold. When he finally made his way back home, he wrapped a leg of lamb in his shirt, jumped out the side opposite the shopkeeper, and quickly made his way home. He let out a shout of joy when he entered his home. It was a shout that his entire family had heard, which caused them to gather. He told them his story and showed them the wrapped meat. Although his grandfather was not entirely on board, his sister and mother were jumping for joy. They knew that this meat was something that meant a good future for all of them, and that they could afford their father's care. The son quickly unwrapped his treasure, and the cacophony of joy ended. The son had not grabbed a leg of lamb, but a human limb. His grandfather immediately yelled at him for what he had done, what he had brought into their household. He took the meat and went to start a fire outside in order to burn the meat before anyone found out about it. His sister comforted their mother, who was crying. The son felt great shame and went to bed. After a long and well-needed rest, he woke up to the sound of people gathering around the busy shop, their own. He asked what had happened, and the family told them that they had spoke a great deal after he had gone to sleep. They all decided they needed to do this, even the grandfather. They cooked the limb and, after trying some of the forbidden meat, called in a favor to the lords that they had previously sold to. This piece of meat was given to the king, and the word had spread quickly. Their shop had meat that the king himself had put orders in for, and they had been made the king's supplier. My father stopped the story at this point. I thought of it as strange, but a simple folk tale, a family legend. He then showed me something that I never would have imagined, what he had been working on every morning while I was asleep. He had done an excellent job to never reveal the family secret. Every morning, before even the street animals were awake, my father would chop, skin, fillet, boil, and prepare various pieces of human flesh. I was sick. I felt as if I was to blame. He needed to continue this horrible tradition. He needed to kill people for what? For my sake? To pay my tuition? For the constant medical bills to make sure that we stayed healthy? To pay every other bill that we needed to live? I couldn't take the burden, and I couldn't deal with the fact that my father was a murderer. So I panicked and ran away. When I saw my father next, I had to hear the rest of the story. Even though my dad was a killer, I knew he wouldn't kill me because I was the reason he was doing it in the first place. He was paying for us to have a better life. He continued the story, and here's the important part. The grandfather, in order to meet the new demand of the meat shop, went to the other shopkeeper and explained the situation. He apologized for what his son had done, but insisted that he needed access to the supplier. He wouldn't ask how the supplier had such fresh bodies, and he would even cut the other shopkeeper in for a 50-50 split on the money. He explained that this was needed because his son was ill, and they had to afford the medical care and supplies. Even with a 50-50 split, they would be able to afford it, thanks to all the new demand. The shopkeeper was firm in their denial of his request. The grandfather persisted, explaining how they absolutely needed this to help his son, who was the main laborer of the family. The shopkeeper again disagreed. The grandfather asked if he could purchase all the stock the shopkeeper had right then and there, but he was denied a third time. In his desperation, he pushed the shopkeeper out of the way. He must have been a very strong man, or perhaps very desperate, because the shopkeeper was knocked back into the wall, his head striking it with a cracking sound. My grandfather ignored this, pushing on with his mission, grabbing as many bags of meat as he could carry. As he was carrying them out of the store, the shopkeeper told him that for doing this, his wish would be granted. His son would be able to work and provide for the family for as long as his age allowed him. The grandfather, after stopping to hear this, simply turned away and continued on to his family shop. What our family didn't know about that shopkeeper was that he was a witch, one who had cursed the family in a strange way that did not manifest until he was long gone. The day after the grandfather had stolen the bags of meat, his son miraculously recovered. He went from coughing up blood, having a high fever, chills and aches, to no symptoms whatsoever. But what seemed to be a blessing turned out to be a curse. The father had no symptoms of this terrible ailment for his entire life, until he became too old to continue working. The day after he retired, he felt a strange sensation in his throat. He started sweating. Mucus began dripping from his nostrils and then pouring. He began violently coughing up blood. It was said that he even exclaimed between gasps for life that his head was on fire, that it felt like his insides were being replaced by thorns, cutting him apart. He had died a most violent death. The family speculated that this must have been the witch's curse, based on what the grandfather had told them way back when he took the meat. This was apparently a fitting explanation for the time period. With the deaths of the father, they began to worry. They wondered if they too were cursed. Ultimately, possibly as a way of easing their racing minds, they decided that it was just the father who would be affected. They believed that the witch's curse was over with his death. It was not. As soon as every person stopped working, they died an incredibly grotesque death. Over the years, things were discovered about the curse, that it would happen regardless of if the person ever actually retired. Once they reached retirement age, they were at risk of the curse, giving them a horrific end. It didn't matter if they had spent their lives working until a certain point. If they tried to end their lives, the curse would take them in an even more horrific fashion than the others. If they tried to show that this would happen to anyone else, it would take them before they were able to. There was no way to avoid it or to show that it existed to those outside the family. It was eventually discovered that the accumulation of pain throughout a person's life would be inflicted 100-fold onto them whenever the curse was activated. Ancestors who had been injured in wars would receive the most extreme, unbearable, searing hot pain in the places where they were shot or stabbed. Those who had only broken bones in their lives would feel as if their bones were being ground into powder. Any scrapes would feel as if sandpaper were being rubbed over and over and over on their open flesh. The only way to avoid this was seen with those who lived simple lives, without much injury or illness. They would not experience as terrible an ending. However, this is easier said than done. To avoid all injuries, aches, pains, and more for an entire life is not an easy task. Not a single person in my lineage has died perfectly or peacefully on their deathbed. They have all died the most horrific deaths imaginable, save for the lucky few who were able to live a sheltered life. My father had explained that this was why he had always watched me like a hawk. This was why our medical bills were so high, beyond the average person's yearly checkups. He said he always tried his best to make sure I was safe and healthy growing up. But what parent doesn't? I didn't realize the gravity of the situation, and he didn't want to scare me as a child or ruin my childhood by living a completely sheltered life. This was his way of going about this. He said that he did the best he could without jeopardizing my having a normal life. He didn't want me to live too scared to do anything. No. Now that I was older and mature enough in his eyes to understand, without it completely destroying my worldview, he had told me. But he was wrong. There was no way I would ever be okay with learning the truth. We should have foreseen the possible outcomes. This is why I wish I was dead, but I don't want to die. Growing up, I had managed to stay safe and healthy, thanks to the precautions in place. But now, my death will be too painful. Everything I had learned about my family didn't matter to me at that point. I just wish my dad had told me before now. I didn't want to hear anything that he had to say, but, like I mentioned before, I had to. It's not like I could wheel around my own bed anyway, much less past the nurses. I already couldn't handle the pain. I wish my attempts were successful.